Well, Ryan, it's good to see you, man.
Good to see you too. It's been a little while for
Yeah, we,
us.
we've taken a couple episodes off. It's great to get back into the saddle with you, man.
Yeah, and we have some good topics brewing now, so it seemed like we needed a little space anyways for some fresh topics to emerge.
Yep. Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, we've got actually the next few shows, next few months of shows kind of sketched out.
Yeah, it's nice.
But for today, I think we've got what feels to me like a special topic for us to
Yeah.
explore today. So just to kind of throw it on the table, today we're going to be titling this show Inhabit Your Bardo. And for those who aren't familiar of what a bardo is,
hmm
so this comes from the Buddhist tradition,
hmm
and it's usually, when people use the word bardo, usually what they're talking about is this sort of in between state between life and death. The
hmm
idea being that, we live our lives, we pass away, and then we find ourselves in this bardo realm, which
hmm
is a transitional state between lifetimes.
hmm
It's a beautiful sort of mythology of life and death. It's a beautiful metaphysics of life and death. And it's not exactly what we're talking about today, because I think like so much of Buddhist cosmology, you can sort of take these ideas and you project them outwards, as far as you can go. And when you do so, you see something like Bardo realms and these, sort of
hmm
transition points between lifetimes, and a lot of it again feels a little bit, it feels like a belief system almost, right? I mean, it's sort of,
Yeah.
here's a way of coping with death, and Christianity has its version, and all these different religious traditions have come up with various strategies to help us find meaning in death, be more accepting and embracing. We are cursed with knowledge of our own death. We're
hmm
the only
hmm
species that we know of
hmm
that has this particular curse. And so we
hmm
have elaborated a number of stories and narratives and whatnot to sort of try to make sense of that.
Yeah.
And, as usual with Integral, we generally like to say things like everyone is right. So we try to almost reverse engineer sort of an integral metaphysic that can make space for all these different kind of perceptions of what happens after death and all of that.
hmm
But again, I don't think this is actually, we're not going to be talking about today, or we're not going to be focusing on necessarily that transition between life and death. Instead, what we're going to be doing is noticing how, again, like so many of these beautiful cosmological ideas, it's actually not so much describing a reality out there as much as it's describing an ongoing reality in here. So I think the basic thesis of the show, of what we're going to be talking about today, is that this concept of a bardo, we are constantly already within a bardo realm. Every moment is a bardo. Everything that we experience in this world, in our lives, is in a state of transition. And I think that there are a number of perspectives that can be taken. There are a number of practices that can be performed, which helps sort of shift our awareness to appreciate the fact that we are constantly in this state of transition. And I think this is important because, particularly these days, I think there is an overall sense of stuckness or of arrested development on a mass scale. And a lot of people, I feel like, are feeling almost subject to forces that they cannot control. And therefore, they feel small in relation to these gigantic, sort of impersonal forces that threaten to kind of squish them like a bug, right?
hmm
But I think that there is an opportunity to kind of reorient to that, to actually sort of notice all of the various attachments and projections that we put forth into the world that actually sort of cycles into these patterns of conditioning that we carry with us from moment to moment, day to day, lifetime to lifetime, really. So that's what I want to be talking about today, is sort of how to enact our lives, how to enact the world around us as this sort of perpetual Bardo state where we
hmm
have an opportunity to add something new, right? Where we have an
hmm
opportunity to consciously navigate these transitions in our lives in sort of whatever domain we find them, right?
hmm
We can
hmm
talk about like the transitions we have to make with our own biology, right? Our own
Mhm.
physical bodies, which are
Mhm.
constantly in a state of transition and changing over time. We can talk about navigating the transitions in our relationships, right? One of the examples I often think of for this is, raising a daughter, right? When you're raising a kid, you are watching transition after transition after transition. And
Mhm.
it's like every time our kids kind of move past one fulcrum point, and sort of stabilize at another stage of development, etc., there is something really, really beautiful that is found, that is gained, that is sort of
Mhm.
taken on. And there's a sadness because there is something that is lost. There's something that is
Mhm.
let go, right?
Mhm.
Like my 9-year-old today is a different girl than she was when she was 7 years old. And it's
Mhm.
amazing to watch that
Mhm.
growing up process.
Mhm.
And I have memories of who she was when she was 7, and that little girl isn't here anymore. She's
Mhm.
someone new now. She's
Mhm.
someone different. And,
Yeah.
there's a lot of that she's taken on and she continue, that she's inherited.
Mhm.
But there's also a lot of sort of new layers that get added on. And whenever
Mhm.
you add a new layer, it kind of changes, the the composition of who we are as individuals.
Mhm.
And and the other piece I just want to say is sort of the personal piece. What provoked this topic for me in the first place was I have a really, really good friend whose mom recently passed away.
Mhm.
And I'm actually in the process of making for them an urn, a temporary
Mhm.
urn, so that he can
Mhm.
distribute her ashes, which is
Mhm.
actually I'm working on it. It's this
No.
box right here.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So as I'm working on this box, I'm trying to deliberately sort of infuse it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
With my own contemplations. And
Yeah.
it just has me in a very sort of
Mhm.
reflective mode right
Mhm.
now.
Mhm.
And the idea for this particular show kind of emerged within
Mhm.
that kind of
Yeah.
tender space.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Of loss, of reverence,
Yeah.
of love,
Mhm.
etc. So it's
Well, it's
it's
beautiful.
something that's been kind of
Yeah.
feeling alive for me
Very
recently.
embodied. Yeah. Well, thanks for setting us up with that, Corey. I loved this topic as soon as you shared it. In many ways, there's so many ways I've been palpably feeling the nature of transition in the last year in my life, and probably just all of us have, the state of the world and going through a pandemic that's felt like a certain state, right? And one thing I want to add on the clarification, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, we're using this traditional term Bardo, and like you said, we're not like doing some traditional formal exploration of that term in that context only. We want to broaden it out into the integral map and framework.
Mhm.
One thing though, in the Tibetan Buddhist system, what's funny is actually this year I finally read all the way through the so-called Tibetan Book of the Dead,
Mhm.
full translation of it. And it goes in Tibetan Buddhism, there's actually 6 bardos. So it's not just,
The
in some
Bardo.
traditions there is like between death and life, but to share those in case anybody's listening to that, these are actually really applicable here in integral, as you'll see. But the first one is birth and life.
Mhm.
That's a whole bardo. We're in that dream state. So Ken talks about dream states a lot. That's a bardo. It's a different state. Meditation, which usually like meditative absorption, but we can experience different states of consciousness and feel like, hey, that's a different state, different bardo. Death itself, that moment of death. And then there's that one that everybody's really interested in because it's the one that's we're all anticipating and wondering about. And like you said, there's lots of different ways of conceiving of that. And that's where the nature of mind is revealed, like that we can directly, nakedly experience. It's an opportunity. And the characterizations of like what happens in death and the in-between state in the Tibetan Buddhist system is very Tibetan Buddhisty. Um, and that's where you would have to go for the essence, because it's like, oh, is everybody going to see peaceful and wrathful deities as presented in
Right.
Tibetan Buddhism? Well, but if you look at the essence, like, oh, well, it makes sense that whatever we have been cultivating in the transition of life in totality is probably going to, that we're going to experience the nature of mind and all of its display in whatever forms. That seems to make sense to me, because it's just like, hey, we go to sleep and dream, all kinds of shit comes up, right?
That's right.
And then there's becoming. So becoming,
Mhm.
being born again. So some of these, like in the Tibetan system, we can take them as just like the general title and feel how we experience all of those things in life. Even the idea of like dying and being an in-between state, and then what do we do emerging from that state in life. So anyways, the idea, like you're saying here, of like, hey, we're always in a state, that's exactly how it is, even in a traditional sense in Tibetan Buddhist system, of like there's never a place where they say now you're no longer in a Bardo.
Right.
This is like, no, constantly.
Right.
uh, so yeah, I've really appreciated that, because even just looking at that model in a traditional way, it makes the thing that happens for me is I want to pay attention to what is the nature of this Bardo, whether it's this moment or a phase, like months, what characterizes it, and how I understand that and characterizing it is informed by what I'm aware of, right? So if I'm aware of 4 quadrants, for example, I can include that in understanding this particular transition state, and we're always in a transition state. There's always a sense of groundlessness, and I know you have a great way of framing this that I'm sure you're going to share. But yeah, with traditional, you're looking for the essence, you're looking for waking up. But here we're taking it, we can include that, but we're going beyond the waking up.
Right. No, it's all beautifully said. And thanks for those clarifications on the different sort of kinds of Bardos that we can experience, all of which I think are applicable to this conversation. And, on Integral Life, we actually have a web course with Andrew Holacek, which I sort of tongue in cheek titled, "Okay, I'm Dead. Now what?"
Yeah, that's right. That's
Right.
right. I
So
like
it's
that
it's
title.
actually it's a really wonderful little course that is presented as a way to prepare ourselves for that sort of great big end of the rainbow Bardo realm, that presumably we're all going to experience when, sort of entropy wins out over extropy, and
Yeah.
we,
Yep.
inevitably die. But what's interesting about that is, at least as framed by Andrew in that series, is that the way that we prepare for that sort of great big Bardo at the end of all things, the way we prepare for it is actually by practicing the Bardo, navigating the Bardo in our everyday lives, in sort of the micro level minutia of our everyday lives, right? It's so Andrew likes to talk about things like developing practices for lucid dreaming, right? Which is a way to sort of familiarize ourselves with that particular Bardo realm as almost a staging ground of sorts, right? The more we can practice sort of navigating the subtle realm of our own dreamscape, that we are learning the exact same postures, right? The spiritual postures that we require in order to navigate sort of the end of life Bardo realm. And I like to push that sort of teaching sort of even further. So there's not only sleeping practices, but there's obviously any number of waking practices. And part of that is this ongoing practice of mindfulness, right? Where we actually begin to notice that every step we take, every action we take, every movement we participate with in this world is a micro Bardo realm in itself. Every door you walk through, when you walk through a door from one room to another room, you are walking through sort of a gateless gate of the Bardo realm itself. And there is always opportunities for new perceptions and new opportunities for creativity when we are making these kinds of transitions. And I think that this is to me, this is what a practiced life means, right? We're not just sort of unconsciously following the habituations and the conditionings that we are inheriting from moment to moment, but we are adding to that conditioning this opportunity for recognition, right? This recognition of sort of absolute reality, ground of being, the nature of mind, however we want to frame it, right? There's an opportunity for recognition, which also provides an opportunity for more conscious engagement with every facet of our lives. Right. And not just more conscious engagement, but also it becomes a wellspring, a source, this sort of undying source of things like appreciation and gratitude. Right. Because when you actually begin to notice the sort of ephemeral, constantly changing nature of reality itself, there almost automatically this response of gratitude comes online. Like, I'm just so grateful for the way this universe has arranged itself right now, with all of its comforts and all of its discomforts. Hopefully it's the right kind of discomfort that's provoking, even more change and more growth and more transformation. You kind of need that friction, so you extend the gratitude to the friction itself. And I
Yeah.
think that all of this becomes part of this ongoing practice of living our lives fully and fulfillingly, right? So that, again, and it's all sort of in a way a dress rehearsal for that big final
Yeah.
Bardo to come. As Ken Wilber often says, if you die before you die, then when you die, you won't die, which is an
Yeah.
awesome tongue twister.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things that I appreciate that I bought that translation of Tibet Book of the Dead a long time ago. I mean, it's been on my shelf for a long time. And I tend to do that. I have lots of books that I want to read, but I haven't got to yet. They're just filling up my office. But there's something kind of neat and magical a little bit that it comes up at the right time for me to read it. And I appreciate that I read it now versus a long time ago, because say 20 years ago, the presentation, for example, on death was magical in a different sense, in like, ooh, wonder what that's like going to the movie theater and getting some popcorn. And it was something special and not something that I really connected to actually in my living experience. But reading through it and feeling into it now, there's something more grounded about it naturally, where just feeling like, well, yeah, I don't care how it's presented, but to me, there's some sense of that, like, hey, it's going to be worthwhile prepping, not just for a moment of death, but yeah, what happens after death? We can use an interval map to at least orient a little bit with that, to say like, hey, it may not just be a physical lights out and that's it. But it's really simple. It's just like, well, practice now, like right now, like this is not for later, not even special for later. Like, oh, I need to practice something special now for something special that's going to happen later. The best practice is practicing right now for the same reason, for this Bardo, and it'll only help later. And saying a little bit more.
Can I just say
Yeah,
real
go
quick?
ahead.
I think, because I think that sort of highlights a point. Our very concept of later is itself one of these illusions that is sort of arising and falling within the Bardo realm of this present moment right now. There is no later.
Yeah.
There is no before. We are, there's no here, there's no there. We are sort of perpetually existing within this state of in-between.
Yeah, really.
There's only that sort of
Get used to it
ongoing
now.
unfolding of the now moment.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned mindfulness and feeling into here. So starting this conversation from kind of like a foundational level, which is kind of what we're doing, of like, hey, Bardo, we're always in a Bardo. This is foundational. We can get into specifics, like specific transitions in any way, like in the interval map. But something I find helpful in a foundational sense is like the combination of mindfulness and then awareness practices. We would differentiate these two in Buddhist Geeks map. Mindfulness lets me really pay attention to what's going on in real time. And you get that sense of like what you're saying, the fluidity, that everything is changing. And so nothing's really static. We're not static. All the experiences that are arising are not static. And so that can help us recognize, hey, things aren't as stable as what we thought. And we can have some refinement of paying attention to what's actually happening, which is helpful to understand the state, the Bardo we're in on a microcosm, macrocosm. Awareness practice, though, helps to not make that completely maybe going insane or overwhelming. So awareness is the unchanging space of everything happening, from mind. Yeah, the ground of being. So if I can disentangle myself from the habitual entangling with experience and content, then I can relax. Which is really good, just in general, and it helps me to pay attention more, actually. So this is like in this sense, how I'm presenting this, they're like a kind of 1-2 combo. So I bring that up because people at any given time may need one or the other. Of course, other practice like heartfulness, you mentioned a lot of heartfulness arising. Sometimes it takes a little while for people. Some people are very heartful oriented, and so that's their go-to practice, but then sometimes it takes a while. It takes a while for the practice to work us over, for us to let go deeply enough to then say, okay, I'm grateful for this.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's gorgeous. No, and I love how you're invoking sort of the ground of being, because you can't observe sort of one side of that, of the absolute. When it comes to the absolute and the relative, you cannot observe simply one side without also observing the other side,
Yeah.
right? They really come, I mean, this is the non-dual, this is the ultimate non-dual pair right
Yeah.
here,
Yeah.
right?
Classic. And Ken points to it all the time in integral maps. So it's like one of those nice crossover points where like very much classically presented in waking up, but also super relevant in just everyday life and in the integral map.
Yeah,
Like how, because that's always a big question. It's like, how does this waking up business relate to anything else
right.
aside from what might be presented as a special realization? But it's like, well, then so what?
Yep.
But that's how it relates to me for like these transitions, because transition very much speaks to like the content of everything that's happening and all the quadrants and lines and
Yeah.
all this stuff.
No, it's exactly right. Because when you are perceiving that literally everything is constantly in a state of flux, right? There
Yeah.
are no solid objects. There is nothing exists that is independent of everything else, right?
Mhm.
So you have this radical sort of ongoingness, this ongoing
Yeah.
flow where
Uh-huh.
reality is sort of, washing into reality, and this is what manifestation is. When you
Mhm.
perceive that, you have no choice but to then also, I mean, it sort of, again, it just leads you right there. You begin to notice the one thing, the only thing that is not changing. And the
Mhm.
only thing that is not changing is the absolute awareness
Mhm.
itself, right? This
Yeah.
effortless awareness, the ground of being, which is forever unseeable, right? I mean, that's why
Mhm.
I think it often takes people so long to notice it in the first time, because there's nothing to notice, because it's what's doing the noticing.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
It can be
Yeah,
hard.
right.
You get sort of lost in the display of form, which is again constantly kind of recombining and shifting, and new emerging,
Mhm.
sort of things are happening all the time. And yet before and beyond it all, and this is where prepositions really break down, because it's not
Yeah,
before, it's
right.
not
Language, yeah.
beyond, but
Yep.
it sort of gives you a spatial idea of where to locate it.
Right.
Before and beyond it all is this effortless ground itself, the only thing that is
Yep.
never changing, while everything in the manifest realm is constantly changing.
Yeah.
And we
And
are sort of, forced to reconcile these two. And that's how I think a lot of people have some of their very initial kind of non-dual experiences, where
mhm.
suddenly that distinction kind of collapses, right? And there's no
Mhm.
more sort of awareness on this side, and sort of the ever shifting realities on the other side.
Uh-huh.
There's only that oneness that isn't even a oneness, it's just simply a not two-ness.
Yeah.
That you can't talk about it without sounding like Yoda.
Yeah, well,
um
for sure. That's, what I would say though, it's interesting is like people can be very there's a typology that plays out in waking up, um that, for example, awareness and mindfulness, a person may practice one or the other pretty predominantly, especially when we first come to a path. We tend to like go all in on a particular flavor that works for us. And I want to just present these two as like a couple antidotes depending on who we are or what our experience is in a particular transition. So overwhelm, like with like a fire hose of experience,
mhm.
can then benefit from a letting go, not a tracking of it all, but letting go of it all into bigger space, and being able to rest like that. So there's just yeah, there's more ability to be present with what's happening. On the other hand, if there's like a stuck, like an inertia, right? It's just like as an example, then that's where mindfulness can be really helpful. It's kind of like, what do you notice? Like if everything feels the same and it's not moving, it's like, what do you notice? And we start paying attention that, okay, oh, that's a relief that actually it's not one singular unchanging experience. And for example, in social meditation, using a practice like There Is out loud and doing with others is really great to do this. I find that if a person's just a beginner, can start recognizing this really quickly, because if you sit for 10 minutes and you start just noticing what there is, it's going to reveal itself that, hey, we're not just noticing the same thing literally for 10 minutes, even just 10 minutes. So I would just present like, offer that as a horizontal typological thing that like
Yeah.
one or the other may be beneficial for that. And then of course, we can bring in other practices, like maybe heartfulness is the right antidote as well, of like, forget all of that, like come into the heart
Right.
and feel the tenderness of the moment, which
Right.
you mentioned brought you into this
That's right.
topic, you know?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think this speaks to so we just got a question on YouTube, which I think right now might be an appropriate time to answer it. The question is, can we function as an individual in the relative manifest world if we are in a constant non-dual unity consciousness?
I tell people, I mean, this is just me. It's kind of like, I'll start with saying it doesn't matter. Like I will end up saying, like, if I'm working with somebody and they ask me this, like, let's forget about that. Let's focus on something else. Actually, let's focus on something that feels very, very tangible. So for example, if a person is telling me like, hey, I feel like I'm in this state constantly and I'm having trouble, for example, I'm not saying that this person is saying that, but like, that's something to work with. That's tangible in a person's experience. But usually, like when this question comes up a lot, like, but in an abstract way, usually conceptually, I don't know that a person just abiding 24/7 in what might be called a non-dual state of consciousness. I know there are people who claim that, and maybe that's true. But yeah, I think it's more about the recognition of that. They experience the direct insight that then transforms us. Like it's, and there's even debate about that. I know Daniel Ingram puts out an idea of like, hey, what happens if there's a traumatic brain injury or something like that? Does that then affect any insight we've had in this life, in this body? I don't know. But aside from those kind of questions, it's very palpable if a person rests and directly recognizes nature of awareness, ground of being, always already, and like really truly can let go, then that permeates who we are. Like we can take, like, yeah, I can be in whatever state playing video games with you.
Right.
That recognition isn't evaporated, and like I may like get involved in something or I may be upset or whatever, but I can come back to that and rest. And then that's a capacity that I think we can cultivate in an embodied way, the ability to return home, the ability to let go deeply into like a non-dual state. I think more like a non-dual orientation, being able to like dance with that. So like Adyashanti's book, Emptiness Dancing, something like that. Like we can dance. Because if we were biasing any one or the other, like non-dual, you can get attached to non-dual, which is like then there's nothing to do.
Yep.
Because absolute and relative are no different, and why bother with anything else?
Right.
As where language and everything, I find it's like only appropriate when a person is really there and in their path, and then wrestling with that in their embodied integration into life. That's my response to that anyway. So I'm saying don't even sweat it.
Yeah, it's a wonderful response, because I think a lot of it, you know, I love the question. I really love the question, because even asking the question sort of faces us to confront how we are conceiving of something like non-duality in the first place.
Yeah.
And I think one of the important points is that you know, the non-dual experience is no different than the experience you're having right now.
Yeah.
That's not something else that is outside of your conscious experience right now. I mean, that's sort of, you know, that's why Ken uses sort of, you know, words like always, already when he's describing non-duality, because it's not like suddenly everything changes, right? And then we have these new perceptions of reality that never existed before. There's an incredible simplicity, so simple it's hard to notice when it comes to talking about non-duality. And one of the things that it's not, that I think it's often sort of conceived of, is as this kind of fusion, right? Everything gets like fused together, and then form and emptiness become like this kind of oatmeal where you can't differentiate anymore, and everything is just sort of the same stuffness. And I think, you know, one of the ideas is that when you are already in a non-dual state of consciousness right now. I think that's the ultimate point. You are already there. Just a lot of us haven't noticed that. And even that sentence is full of all sort of contradictions and paradoxes. But one of the things is that I think it's when you're inhabiting that non-dual space, it's not like all of the products of the manifest world just evaporate into sameness. Like you still have a self, a lowercase separate self that still exists. You simply realize that it is not ultimately separate from everything else in your perception.
Yeah.
right? So you still have these gradients of being, of existing in the relative world. You're just seeing through the illusion that what's on this side of my face is separate from what's on that side of my face.
There's a deeper sense of interbeing, interconnection. And really, like you said, so the integral map helps everything you just said, like helps us to recognize that, it helps us to recognize waking up, how the realization of non-duality, and lowercase s self, etc. So a person who gets attached to that realization, then it becomes pretty obvious that like trying to squash form, like trying to point to the essence of form constantly, like saying like anybody who's talking about form is just getting lost in illusion kind of thing. And so really they're biasing towards kind of emptiness, but it's presented like that. But really it's like, well, what happens afterwards? That's always the thing I'm interested in, is like, well, how is life like now for you? Whatever realization it might be, whatever experience it might be. It doesn't, we can use different maps. Like it's a recognition of the subtle, like that Ken talks about. Now what? What's life like? And Hokai Sobel gave me great questions a long time ago to process experience. And so like one of them was like, how did your body feel? How does your body feel now? How's breathing? How does the world look? And so one of the things is that there's less friction about like absolute and relative. There's just like, that's why I mean the question becomes irrelevant, is that it's okay. It just is like, and we don't have to, like, there's just some friction that we can let go of, and then we respond. And I think that matters. That can change how we experience transition states. And so that's, I think, the beauty of a waking up. If we take it far enough into an integral Dharma awakening, then that's how I keep coming back to it. There's just more space, more room, more ability to let go and be present with what's happening.
That's
so
right.
Yeah.
No, that's critical, because things like sensation, things like perception, they don't just evaporate sort of in the light of non-duality. They're just sort of enacted a little bit differently. And I think the other step there is that it can actually over time begin to reformat our perceptions of reality, because there's certain kind of let's just say mental conveniences, what we might otherwise call illusions, right? There's these heuristics of the mind kind of display themselves, and you begin to realize how partial in a lot of ways our own perceptions and therefore our own sense making really is. So, in preparation for this episode, I wrote sort of what was just to me kind of like almost a cognitive series of pointing out instructions that for me personally lead me into a deeper perception and enactment of the state of constant transition that we ourselves and everything around us are always already in at right now at this moment. And if you don't mind, I'll read something.
Have at it. Yeah.
So here's what I wrote. We are never fully here or there. We exist in a state of perpetual in-betweenness. When it comes to the grammar of our own sense making, nouns are the ultimate illusion. In reality, there are no nouns. We are all verbs, verbing verbs forever. We perceive objects as being static, solid, and stable, but the most we can really say is that these are semi-stable patterns of organization that temporarily exist within some polarity of emergence and entropy. Every holon we see, and I'm going to try to track around the quadrants a little bit, every holon we see in the upper right quadrant that appears to be whole and singular is actually at another level of scale, a dynamic system of subholons. This is true whether we're talking about our bodies, a basketball, or even a single atom. Eventually, the subsystems that compose these holons will break down. So they're never static. They're always moving on one level of reality or another. And when they break down, that results in the inevitable disintegration of the holon. And just like our exterior world exists in this constant state of flux, this state of transition, so does our interior world. Our identity is constantly in transition. And here we're not just talking about things like gender fluidity or changing sexual preferences. Certainly that stuff too, but not only that. We're also talking about how the actual seat of identity itself is constantly changing. It's changing as we grow through these multiple stages of development. It changes as we awaken into these multiple states of consciousness, right? It changes this depending on our surrounding contexts and who we happen to be talking to right now. I'm a different person in a state of transition talking to you right now, Ryan, than I am when I go upstairs after this conversation and talk to my daughter. In fact, no other person ever sees us fully. We are literally a different person for everyone in our lives, for everyone that we relate to. Every person we've ever known enacts us somewhat differently. And these shifting intersubjective contexts in the lower left quadrant allows us to inhabit different parts of ourselves when we're relating to different people. So we can see that transition, right? When I walk up the stairs out of the show and start talking to my family, that is a transition. That stairwell becomes a sort of a Bardo realm in and of itself. It actually reminds me, Ryan, of the biblical quote, "I am who you say I am." That's literally true. That's literally true. And if I ask you, Ryan, who am I? You're going to have a different answer than my mother will have, who will have a different answer than my wife will have, who will have a different answer than, my kid will have. I am all of that, right? But I'm never all of those things simultaneously. I'm constantly transitioning from one of those identities to another identity. Meditation practice helps show us that our minds are themselves a sort of Bardo realm, where past conditions and new creativity intertwine to produce our ongoing inner experience. Meditation actually allows us to widen the aperture of our awareness so that we can witness the microanatomy of the moment itself, where each moment inherits the karmas of the previous moment, novelty, an opportunity for something new to emerge, which then becomes the karma that's inherited by the next moment. This, I think, inverts our perception of things like past, present, and future, right? As we were talking about earlier, as we begin to sort of reorient to reality from the perspective of this ever unfolding, and ultimately inescapable now moment, which I think is the Bardo realm itself, right? It's sort of the container of the Bardo realm itself. There is no past, there is no future. There's only this perpetually self-integrating and self-transcending moment right now, right now, right now. The Big Bang is not something that happened billions of years ago somewhere in space. It's still happening right here. It's still happening right now. And you and we are just some of the countless semi-stable ripples that are dancing on the periphery of that ongoing and ubiquitous explosion. Every moment is a Bardo. Every moment is a death. And every moment is an opportunity for new life.
Beautifully written and said.
Thanks, man.
Love it.
And I think that's, that for me, because, and maybe this is true for our audience as well, but I am one of those people who I kind of have to start with the cognitive, right? I kind of lean with that. I kind of lean with the cognitive. So I try to find these cognitive oriented ways to try to restructure my perceptions, right? Well, here's the different context, right? Let's try to enact reality, even initially just cognitively, through this new heuristic, and then let that kind of trickle.
Totally. That's very common, actually. I mean, I think that happens a lot for lots of folks. Like in Buddhism, you call it a view, but whether it's in that realm or cleaning up realm, we're always starting usually with some kind of view because we intuit something and we're deepening in some way, healing, transforming. And we use a view to help us orient and try to explore something new. And so it's both for me, true that it's arising in our experience organically. And then we use our minds and views to help in that transition or that reorientation.
Yeah.
So that's beautiful. And I love your linguistic take on this too, with the verbs.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a big part of it, right? Is that our perceptions of reality are actually, in a lot of ways, sort of formatted in a deeply unconscious way by the structure of language itself, right? I mean, earlier when we're talking about not, where to locate witness, trying to find these prepositions. It's before, it's behind, it's beyond, it's any number of sort of prepositional spatial kind of relations. It's just this is how our minds are formatted. So we have no choice but to try to use sort of grammar itself as almost metaphorically, almost impressionistically, to try to get a fuller kind of, more deeply realized understanding of how this reality is constructed in the first place. And we're limited in a lot of ways by the structures of that grammar, the structures of language itself.
Yeah.
It's like trying to imagine a color you've never seen, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, language being both some, semi-stable, like the word you used, like the otherwise we don't communicate. There has to be something semi-stable, even, and usually it's at the unconscious level, even though we can then take an outer look and document that. But it's also fluid and changing and evolving, probably in some regards reflective of collective development, which I don't know if anybody's explored exactly. I'm sure Ken has said as much, but like somebody exploring and mapping that. And reminds me of Stuart Davis and our good friend and linguistic nerd as well. His language is,
That's right.
I have tattooed here, what part, a phrase. He created a language to try to be able to better handle some of the things we're talking about, that the grammar itself or how it's structured can embody that and express it a little bit more accurately. And so yeah, it'd be interesting too. That just brought me on another side train.
It is. I mean, it is. It's it's its own sort of rabbit hole. And at some point, maybe what we should do is bring Bruce Alderman on, who actually has a whole sort of thesis of integral grammology.
Oh, cool.
That is way over my head, but I can pretend to kind of hang with him. Maybe we should give him an opportunity to unpack some of that, because I think it's a lot of it really does start, it finds its roots in our language and how we use words to describe these realities. And, language itself, I think, is one of the primary reasons why we have this perception of separateness to begin with, right? It's because language is constructed of these sort of discrete nouns that are verbing in some adjective-y way,
Yeah.
It's how, again, it's not just how we communicate, it's also informing how we're actually thinking about and how we're actually perceiving these realities in the first place. And one of the nice things about, I think, the non-dual experience, and really any number of experiences that we'll call transrational. Well, one of the reasons why they're transrational is because they don't quite fit cleanly into the rational mind. They don't fit cleanly into language without immediately creating paradox, without immediately creating contradiction. Right? What was it Ken said? Something like, paradox is what transrational ideas look like to the rational mind.
Yeah, totally. It's a great point. Also the flip side of all of language, though, is one of my favorite quotes from Religion Tomorrow from Ken. I can't remember how he phrased it. It's really good how he phrases it, but like the miracle of we, about saying that like one person can look at another person and say, like, I understand you, or you understand me, or something like that.
Yes.
That's amazing that happens, and it's happening through I forgot to turn my notifications off, and my partner just texted me because she's running at the track and using AirPods, and they tend to mess up, and she said, "Inhabit your goddamn earbuds." I told her we were doing Inhabit, and she's having trouble with them. So
that's hilarious.
Sorry, that popped up and I couldn't.
No, that was a perfect interjection.
She'll probably, I think it's really funny that I mentioned her. Anyways, yeah, so this like you said, paradox of that, like, hey, grammar can be limiting, and language can provide all kinds of ways in which we kind of get fragmented, maybe and buying into like a static view of things and ourselves and each other, versus like this transitional, fluid, groundless state. And at the same time, we understand each other, which is amazing.
Which really is, yeah, it is a miracle. It really is. And, especially again, when we sort of invert our perception of time and eternity and all that, when we invert our perception from past flowing into present, flowing into future, flip it inside out and look at it as sort of the ongoing sort of ubiquitous performance of the now moment itself, right? There really never was a past, there really never was a future. However, all the karmas from this moment get inherited by the next moment, which get inherited again, and you can feel it happening right now. And when, when you are really deeply engaged in a meditation practice, you can witness it happening right now. This moment to moment sort of micrology of shifting karmas and new creativities that are emerging right now, right now, right now, right now. And when we do that, we get to notice things like, you just mentioned earlier how we in this moment right now are not separate from every conversation that has ever happened before this one, right? We are all of this is sort of continues to build on itself. It continues to kind of snowball, so yesterday's forms, yesterday's discussions get recombined, repackaged, represented to the mind of the moment, which then expresses it in a slightly different way. And we would not be capable of having conversations like this, say 2000 years ago, because we're depending on all sorts of unspoken contexts and happenings and, occasions that, if they don't happen, we don't have sort of the granularity of language to try to parse it in a sensible way to begin with. So everything that's ever happened before this moment is infused into this moment. And I think that's, again, one of the point of noticing, of shifting our mind from a perception of reality as a collection of static objects that are bumping into each other, right, into this sort of different perception of an ongoing, constant transition from one state of being to another state, to another state, to another state. Because we begin to realize how this moment is not separate from the formation of the planet Earth billions of years ago, when it was, like all of those karmas are still with us today. It's why we exist. It didn't happen billions of years ago. It's still happening. It's still happening. This is still the condition right now. And then when I, the next step for me, Ryan, is when I shift from that kind of cognitive, like, let me see if I can perceive these quadrants a little bit differently, that then kind of sinks down into another layer of being where it begins to sort of come through the heart. And that's where the heartfulness really comes online. And one of the things I notice is that there's this, again, ongoingness to these feelings that are associated with these perceptions. So one of the feelings I think that we really want to surface is when you are perceiving constant transition, there is a sadness that comes with that. Because there's an aspect of us that wants to grasp. It wants something to feel solid, either out there or the ground underneath our feet. We want that security of the illusion of stability, the security of the illusion that there really is sort of a ground. And of course there's a capital G ground of being, but the lowercase grounds that we can constantly try to construct for ourselves are themselves entirely transitional. And so we grasp for permanence. We grasp for something to just like hang our hat on for a moment, right? And like to allow ourselves to feel stable, to allow ourselves to feel like a solid object, if only for a moment. So there's a sadness that comes with letting that go. There's a sadness that comes with noticing that what is true right now won't necessarily, and what's real right now and what exists right now won't necessarily exist in the next moment. And so you have to constantly let go, let go, let go. But then in the other side of that, it's like, that's one chamber of the heart. The other chamber of the heart is this constant excitement, right? There's an excitement for novelty, for creativity, for whatever this new form that's going to emerge is going to be. I want to see it. I want to witness it. I want to co-create it, right? I want it to come through me and not around me. And there's this almost sacred feeling celebration of change. Like, thank God things aren't static, right? Thank God things only last a little while, torment us, and then fade away, as Ken often says. There's just a beauty in the fact that like this moment will itself almost reincarnate as the next moment, which will then transition and reincarnate as the next moment. So
Yeah.
again, when we get down to like the absolute finest granularity of our perceptions of time's passing,
Mhm.
that's the hit that we get. And it invites us into, again, a perception of both the ever shifting forms in the relative world and that absolutely unchanging witness consciousness
Mm.
that I find words like witness
Mm.
and I am and all the absolute subjectivity, all of
Mhm.
those are synonymous to me with the word capital N now. The
Mm.
now moment is the witness.
Mm. Mm.
And that becomes almost a koan for me
Mm.
when I'm practicing.
It's beautiful. Yeah, beautifully said. With all this, it reminds me of I believe this is Longchenpa, uh, probably from Basic Space of Phenomena, but like when you get to Sogjin, how they talk about things changes in tone quite a bit. It's definitely not going to be scholarly at all. It's very poetic, and they don't really care much about resolving any paradox. So like one of my favorite ones, this is paraphrasing it, but like they'll say it, or like basic space phenomena, or nature awareness, whatever it might be, that it's nothing at all and yet arises as anything whatsoever.
Mm,
And so they'll use these and they'll say amazing. They'll just keep saying things like this. Can't find anything yet, it's everything. And so at a certain point, that's when we're going back to that discussion about non-duality. It's like you just let go and just be like, yeah, that's it. Like no more processing it. Like it has to be directly realized. And then it's like, and so we can map here to like a deepening. So I want to acknowledge that and say that for me, the most important thing is to be where we are in our own process and development and deepening. We can read about maps and we can read about stages of waking up or stage of development and go, oh, I really want that. It won't really make much of a difference, just like be where we're at. And so it may not be some of these experiences I do think unfold in a
yeah.
deepening where like the heartfulness or a deep appreciation, like they'll talk about in Longchenpa we'll talk about, it's like I'm like a madman laughing at myself. This is crazy, like saying something essentially like that. But for somebody who's maybe not quite there yet, they literally might feel a little crazy, like trying to process this, and they need something to be grounding. It's like feel your feet on the floor, like breathe, like don't try to like emulate this realization
Right.
because it won't help. It'll be actually ungrounding and destabilizing, not true like opening in this kind of grounded presence way. So anyways, I wanted to just frame that there and bringing in the kind of the developmental perspective even in waking up
I think
with
it's
this.
critical. I think it's critical
And
because you're pointing to actually, again, the transitions of our own realization.
yeah,
Our
and
own
so
realization goes through this. Like oftentimes, and maybe you
yeah,
relate to this. I think a lot of our audience probably relates to this. Back in my 20s in particular, I really had a strong hit of that like seeking
yeah,
energy. You know what I mean? Like
right.
there was something for
Oh
me
yeah,
to
me too.
find that I had not yet discovered.
Yes.
And eventually I began to realize that the more I seek, again, here's the paradox. The more I seek, the farther away I get from it, even though it is my always already condition. And
Yeah.
you never get far from it. You
But
can't
here's the thing, man.
escape it.
Yeah, totally. But here's the thing though, like what I mean by be where you are is like, and I remember the same thing for me. And we call it one of the phases of insight, which is our cycle that can be repeated. The first one is seeking.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly how you described it. That's how it feels, and then we can have multiple cycles through this that feel much different, more subtle. But if I'm working with somebody who's really in a seeking phase, the first time of that, let's say even they're in their 20s, something like they put all the typical profile together. I want to support them in the seeking. It's going to
100%.
do no good really to try to practice as if they're close or around an always already realization. Just like, yeah, seeking. All right, I got some good books for you. I got some good practices for you here. Check these out, But then there'll be the recognition of like the pain of like efforting and then having some breakthrough and then realizing like, oh, I'm just getting further and further from what I'm actually seeking. Oh, okay, let's practice differently now because that's the person's experience. So I think like as far as recognizing a bardo, a transition state we're in, we have to feel what's actually true, not what we imagine it could be. And using integral, I would say to do like an embodied tour of the integral map, feeling into what's most salient, what's most prominent. So you can, like, what's up in your life right now going on? What are you feeling into? You can go through the quadrants, but like in an embodied way. Like, is there something highlighted in one quadrant that's really, so if somebody going through a challenging medical experience, a health experience, that maybe like that's what's up most and it's impacting quite a bit in other quadrants, et cetera. It's like that's what's characterizing this particular bardo. The things we're talking about, I think, can be infused in all of that. So like if we practice waking up, we have more fluidity maybe in navigating that tour of the quadrants or the 4 ups, 5 ups now. I don't know how many ups we got now. We're getting, the ups are going up.
We're adding new ups every day.
Yeah. Yeah. So on a
No,
practical standpoint, like we've been setting out views, so that's great. So, and we have, I mean, we could keep expanding into other perspectives, that a person might take on Bardo, and that could be helpful, to like have a more robust tour, embodied tour that we can take. But that's where I would go in the end, is like, I am where I am right now. So let me feel into that. I think too, I'm just going to put a little devil's advocate, that sometimes we may not pay attention. We may be biased. So like biased to an upper left quadrant experience, and we just don't pay attention to the state of things in the lower right quadrant. And it could be really good and beneficial to inhabit that quadrant, to pay attention to it, so that way it can become part of our conscious states, our conscious bardos and transitions, versus like always out of view. So that's kind of the flip side of that like we may only pay attention to what we pay attention to habitually, including in waking up. We can wake up in the same habitual way, paying attention to the same facets of being that we always do, and not including others. So bringing in something cognitively can help broaden that.
Totally. And I think that's kind of the idea is that there's any number of sort of stimulus that can sort of turn that inner dharma wheel, right? That can help you move from one phase in the ever transitioning realization process into another phase. Like for me, you mentioned like medical problems. Like for me, what had the largest easily impact on my own sort of inner sense of spirituality since the first sort of Satori implosion that I had when I was 19 years old was when we were going through my daughter's medical issues. And we were spending, after spending a week in a place like Children's Hospital, which you want to talk about a Bardo realm. That place is, I mean, that's like the Bardo in concrete form, right? I mean, you are suspended between illness and health, between life and death, between sadness and joy. I mean, the full freaking gamut of the human experience can be found.
No theory needed.
Yeah. And the effect that it had on me, Ryan, was, I walked into that hospital one person and I walked out another. And one of the main sort of transitions, right, that I experienced was in how I related to my own spirituality. I walked in the door with any number of spiritual, sort of imaginal forms of spirituality, and all of these like big, beautiful kind of interior mandalas that I've constructed over the years that help me make sense of this, and these beautiful ideas and adornments and ornaments and all of that. And when I went through that particular Bardo, I just noticed how much of that was stripped away because none of it was useful, right? Like none of it was useful. I was just stripped down to the bones of effortless awareness, almost to an agonizing degree, and then free floating compassion for everything that was occurring in that space. And it was just those two things. It was just like awareness, compassion, put one foot in front of the other, awareness, compassion, put one foot in front of the other. And it stripped everything down. It brought it down to the bones. And what was interesting is I experienced that after the fact, and plus for any number of, there was psychological wounding, there was emotional wounding. I mean, it was a traumatic event, but it felt like a dark night. I started to miss the ornaments of my own spirituality, because I used to wear
Yeah.
that shit on my sleeve. You know what
Oh
I mean?
yeah,
It's
for
like,
sure.
like
Right.
I'm meeting someone, let's talk about our spirituality. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It
Right.
became a piece of my identity itself.
Uh-huh.
And then I dropped it. I was sort of forced in a sort of, you know, for
Yeah.
whatever reason, the karma of our lives and of Evie's life and of, you know, my
Yeah.
family's life forced the
Yeah.
dropping of these
Yeah.
idolatries, these spiritual adornments.
Uh-huh.
And I found myself missing them, which turned into a bit of a dark night. I was like,
Right.
am I spiritualitying wrong now? You know, it's
You
not as
know,
like fireworks and all
yeah.
that. It's just, it's quiet now.
Yeah.
It brought me to a very quiet and tender place.
Yeah.
And that quietness, that tenderness, feels sacred, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, man. I mean, you gave just a beautiful, heartful example of a teaching on the phases of insight, literally, like from start to finish.
Mm,
Like that, I would essentially try to describe to people, and if I'm doing a teaching on it, it would just be like, "Hey, this is." I mean, what you said, I was just like, "These are the kinds of general things you feel," but you came through it in such an honest, like, no choice about it experience that's like so powerful, unavoidable to go through that. And whereas like some people, if they don't have that, everyone's going to have difficult experiences and traumas and things like that.
100%.
But if a person is going through kind of like a formal practice, they're going to reach those territories, but it may be just harder to give into and let go into and recognize, because it's happening through like a simulation of sorts, in practice. But with this, it's like there's no simulation for you. That is just like, that's what was happening, and the only way through that was going through that opening and deepening. uh yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, man.
Reminds me of one of those Hindu goddesses. Is it Kali? No, I don't even think it's Kali, but there's one of those crazy Hindu deities whose job it is to almost violently strip these illusions from you, whether
Yeah.
you're ready or not, right? And that was me. I wasn't
Yeah.
necessarily ready. I was grateful that I had, some perspectives that were
Yeah.
valuable for me, but even sort of the luminosity that I associated with those perspectives, even that was taken
Mhm.
out. All
Yeah.
right.
Yep.
Because right now
Makes sense.
what I'm aware of is fear and
Uh-huh.
anxiety and death,
Uh-huh.
and that's okay too. Like I have to,
Uh-huh.
that was sort of one of the wisdoms for me, is I have to invite those things as well. I have to invite those discomforts and find the anti-fragility that comes
Mhm.
naturally with this effortless awareness and sort of the vast expanse, or the perception of a vast expanse that it generates. That becomes the source of that new source of resilience,
Mm.
that is itself what allowed me to put
Mm.
one foot in front of the other, and then again
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
again, you
Yeah.
know.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Corey. I mean, I am so happy that you all made it out to the other side of that in a really good way.
Yeah.
And I know, like you said, that experience, it's all kinds of things happening in that Bardo. Uh,
And that was just, that was
yeah.
my flavor. I think I feel like this is sort of a
Mm,
universal,
man.
it's the old cliche that like love never ends
Hmm.
happily, right? Every
Yeah.
love story is a tragedy,
Yeah.
because eventually we have to let go. We have to
Yeah.
learn how to let go. Now, thank God, in those moments, there was a lot I let go of, but I didn't have to let go of my daughter, right? Thank
Yeah.
God. Thank
Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
But inevitably, we are faced with these experiences.
Yep.
Inevitably,
Yep.
you watching at home are going to experience loss. You
Yep.
you you may already have, right? And each of those is going to become this
Hmm.
this fulcrum in that ever transitioning sort of realization,
Hmm.
right? And that's why I led this with saying sort of there's an intrinsic sadness that comes with these
Hmm.
perceptions of
Hmm.
transition, because we don't want
Yeah.
things to, especially the things that we want the things we love to last forever. And unfortunately, that is not how this reality is composed.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad that you, like I said, you shared like kind of a start to finish personal description of phase of insight that we like to use. And you said something about arriving at a quiet,
Yeah.
tender place. So I think it's important because sometimes people can get really stuck at that dark night and disillusionment, and be recognizing the things that you're talking about are like, oh, we all have to die, and we have to, every love story ends in a tragedy. That becomes the kind of characteristic of that Bardo of disillusionment. But that's not the whole story too, because there's some, otherwise how can we survive that? Like how can we be resilient through that nonstop experience? And so when you share there's a quietness, that's, we talk about equanimity after that, and which is different. It's not like some sparkly ornate kind of experience, but there is spaciousness, there is some okayness, and then the gratitude can emerge, the appreciation of what is good and beautiful can come back online in a deeper way. But you only get there too through going through that some sort of disillusionment, of acceptance of all the things you said. Yeah
That's beautifully
fundamental said. At the core of talking about Bardos and transitions, is these cycles. Yeah.
And cycles, we begin to realize, it's like that old Khalil Gibran quote about joy and suffering. And how, joy and suffering are inseparable. You don't know one without the other. And I always liked that image in the Prophet of, suffering is what sort of carves this trench within us, within which can be filled with joy. And the deeper that suffering goes, the more it can be filled with joy. And I've always really loved that sort of mental.
I love his poetry.
Yeah. Oh, it's beautiful.
Yeah. That's great. Well, speaking of transitions.
Well, Ryan, thanks so much, man. This felt like a moving show.
Yeah.
I mean, I love being able to talk to, people like yourself, just people who are very close to me. And it, it helps me.
Likewise.
Like I said, this all came sort of from a personal experience that I'm having with a friend who I care deeply about. And it led me to this kind of tenderness. And it was really nice to
no, likewise. I was really happy you brought it up. I hadn't even thought about it, but I'm like, oh yeah, this is definitely something I've been feeling into in so many different ways in the last year. So I hope it's beneficial to anybody, whether in solidarity to somebody listening or potentially offering some different ways of navigating transitions. I know it's like, we do a deep dive, but in some sense it's just drop in the bucket for what this could point to, in our lives.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, brother, I love you, man. Thank you so much.
Love you too, man.
And I'm looking forward to the release of Integral Dharma, which we will talk about more in our next episode in September.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Yeah, looking for our next episode.
All right. And to everyone at home, thank you so much for watching us. Let us know in the comments below what you thought of this episode. Was that helpful? What would you add to the conversation? We really want to know what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and how you live this in your own lives. So please let us know. In the meantime, I'll see you next time, buddy.
Yeah. See ya.
All right. Bye.